Building on our previous discussion about the theoretical foundations of historical work, let's now explore how different frameworks attempt to explain the past. We're looking at four distinct models today: formism, organicism, mechanism, and contextualism. Think of them as different toolkits or lenses historians use to make sense of the historical field. Each has its own strengths, weaknesses, and philosophical underpinnings. First up, formism. Imagine a historian who's incredibly good at painting vivid portraits of individuals, dramatic scenes, or specific moments in time. That's often the strength of formism. It's like being a master storyteller, capturing the richness and particularity of the past. Think of many narrative historians, or even some romantic historians, they excel here. They gather a wide array of details, creating a rich tapestry of events and figures. However, the text points out a potential weakness. When these historians try to step back and offer grand generalizations about the whole historical process, those generalizations can sometimes feel too broad, almost empty. They might capture the spirit of an era brilliantly but struggle to formulate testable, precise claims about underlying processes. It's like describing a beautiful painting in exquisite detail, but struggling to articulate the artist's core technique or intent in a way that applies universally. The focus is on the what and the how of specific instances, sometimes at the expense of a robust why or overarching pattern. Now let's shift gears to organicism. This model is all about integration. Think of it like understanding a living organism. You can't just look at the cells. You need to see how they form tissues, organs, and ultimately the whole body working together. The core idea here is this microcosmic-macrocosmic relationship. Individual events or people are seen as parts contributing to larger integrated wholes, nations, cultures, civilizations that have properties greater than or fundamentally different from their individual components. Think of Ranke or the nationalistic historians of the mid-19th century like Mommsen or Treitschke. Their goal isn't just to list events, it's to show how these disparate threads weave together into a coherent, meaningful whole. This gives their arguments an abstract quality, focusing on the process of integration rather than the specifics of each event. Often there's an implicit or explicit telos, a sense of direction or purpose towards which this organic whole is evolving. Even Ranke, while resisting explicit teleology, focused on identifying these intermediary structures like the nation, suggesting an underlying integrative force. It's about seeing the forest for the trees, emphasizing the emergent properties of the collective. Next, we have mechanism. If organicism is like biology, mechanism is like physics or chemistry. It's driven by the quest for causal laws governing historical processes. Think Newton's laws of motion or Lavoisier's laws of chemical combination. The mechanist believes that historical events, much like physical phenomena, are determined by underlying universal laws. Individual actors and their actions are seen as manifestations of extra-historical agencies, rooted in the scene, the social, economic, political environment. The goal is to uncover these laws, the principles that dictate outcomes. Think of historians like Buckle, Taine, or Marx. For them, understanding history means figuring out the gears and levers that drive historical change. Like the organicist, the mechanist tends to abstract away from individual uniqueness, focusing instead on classes of phenomena and the laws they supposedly obey. An explanation is complete only when these governing laws are identified, allowing the historian to show how specific events are functions of those laws. It's a reductionist approach, aiming to find the deterministic rules behind the apparent chaos of history. Finally, let's consider contextualism. This approach tries to strike a balance, avoiding both the extreme dispersal of formism and the heavy abstraction of organicism and mechanism. The core idea is simple. To understand an event, you must place it within its specific context. Think of it like understanding a single sentence requires knowing the paragraph, chapter, and book it belongs to. The contextualist aims to identify the threads linking the subject of study to its surrounding historical space and time. Who were the key players involved? What were the prevailing ideas, institutions, and circumstances? Where did the event come from? And what were its immediate and longer-term consequences? This process involves what philosophers call colligation, tracing the connections. Think of Jacob Burckhardt as a prime example. He wasn't looking for grand laws or organic wholes, nor was he just listing isolated facts. Instead, he sought to understand the unique character of periods and epochs by examining the interrelationships within finite provinces of historical occurrence. It's about mapping the local networks of significance, acknowledging that causes and influences are complex and specific, not reducible to simple laws or grand designs. Now, here's where things get interesting politically. Despite the theoretical appeal of all four models, the text argues that in practice, especially within the academic establishment since the early 19th century, formism and contextualism have dominated. Why? Because explanations based on organicist or mechanistic principles have often been viewed with suspicion. Thinkers like Hegel or Marx, who leaned heavily into these modes, were frequently dismissed as falling into the dreaded philosophy of history. This dismissal wasn't always based on rigorous epistemological grounds, the text suggests. There wasn't necessarily a clear, undeniable reason why one mode should be preferred over another, based purely on logic or evidence. Instead, the hostility seems to stem from something extra epistemological, perhaps ethical or ideological concerns. The argument goes, by sticking to formism and contextualism, historians can keep history safe from the perceived dangers of scientism, the uncritical imitation of science, and avoid the metaphysical traps of grand historical theories. But this raises a crucial question. Is this exclusion truly based on objective criteria, or is it a bias, a pre-existing opinion about what kind of knowledge is acceptable or desirable for studying human society? This leads us directly into the heart of the matter, the ideological implications inherent in any historical account. The argument here is quite bold. Because history isn't a hard science like physics, simply claiming to have found some kind of formal coherence, some pattern or structure in the past, inevitably brings with it certain assumptions about the nature of the world and how we know it. These assumptions, in turn, carry ideological weight, influencing how we understand the present and what we might want to do about it. In other words, the very way you choose to explain the past shapes your perspective on the present and potentially dictates the kinds of actions you deem legitimate. The text focuses on how different combinations of a historian's aesthetic choices employment, their argumentative strategy argument, and the resulting moral or political undertones ideological implication combine to produce these effects. It's not just about describing the past, it's about how that description implicitly or explicitly guides our view of now. To unpack these ideological implications, the text draws heavily on Karl Mannheim's analysis of ideologies. Mannheim identified several key types, and here we focus on four relevant ones for 19th-century thought: anarchism, conservatism, radicalism, and liberalism. Now, Mannheim stresses that these aren't just political labels. They represent distinct value systems that claim authority derived from reason, science, or realism. Unlike more authoritarian ideologies that rely on divine revelation or charismatic leaders, these four engage in public debate, presenting themselves as cognitively responsible. They differ fundamentally in their views on whether society can or should be studied scientifically, what lessons history teaches, whether they want to maintain or change the status quo, how they envision change happening, and crucially, their orientation towards time. Where do they locate the ideal form of society? Importantly, the text notes that a historian doesn't need to consciously adopt one of these positions. Their chosen mode of explanation can still resonate with or imply one of these underlying ideological stances. Let's quickly sketch out these ideological profiles based on Mannheim. On social change, everyone acknowledges it happens, but they differ wildly. Conservatives are wary of big leaps, preferring slow, natural growth. Liberals see adjustments, like tuning a fine instrument, within a basically sound system. Radicals and anarchists, however, believe fundamental change is necessary. Radicals wanting to rebuild society on new foundations, anarchists aiming to dismantle society altogether for a return to a more authentic community. Regarding pace, conservatives favor nature's rhythm, liberals prefer the pace of democratic processes. while radicals and anarchists entertain the possibility of rapid, even cataclysmic, transformation. Time orientation is key. Conservatives see the present as the best possible reality. Liberals project a better future but far off. Radicals expect utopia soon and advocate radical means now. And anarchists often romanticize a lost past innocence and see utopia as achievable through self-awareness anytime. This also relates to whether they aim for social congruence, fitting within existing structures, or transcendence, aiming beyond it. These differences shape their views on historical knowledge too. Okay, now for a fascinating detour into rhetoric and linguistics, the theory of tropes. The idea here is that the deep structural ways we think about and explain the world, including history, are shaped by the fundamental patterns of figurative language we use. Think back to Renaissance rhetoric. The four master tropes are metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. Metaphor is about transfer, finding similarities between things like love is a rose. It's representational. Metonymy involves substitution based on association, like using the White House to mean the U.S. government. It's reductionist, focusing on a part or aspect. Synecdoche uses a part to represent the whole or vice versa, often to signify a quality, like all hands on deck or the ship is magnificent. It's integrative. And irony? That's the tricky one, involving negation or self-aware critique, like saying someone is a cold fish when they're actually unfriendly. It's dialectical or sentimental, questioning the surface meaning. The argument is that these linguistic strategies aren't just stylistic flourishes. They provide the very templates, the protocols, for how we conceptualize and explain complex realities, including the historical field. So, how does this connect to historical writing? The text proposes that certain combinations of aesthetic employment, argumentative strategy, and ideological implication are naturally drawn together, like elective affinities. Think of it as a matrix. Certain narrative styles like tragic, comic, satirical pair well with certain explanatory approaches like mechanism, organicism, and lead to specific ideological leanings like radical conservative. For instance, Ranke's work is consistently cast in a comic mode, aiming for reconciliation, supported by an organicist argument uncovering integrative structures, leading to distinctly conservative implications. But the real drama happens when historians deliberately create tension by combining inconsonant elements. Mucklet, for example, used a romantic, emotionally charged employment with a formist, broad generalizing argument to serve a liberal ideology. Hegel, meanwhile, employed both tragic and comic elements, justified by an organicist argument, allowing readers to derive either radical or conservative conclusions. Despite this internal tension, the best works maintain a coherent vision. And where does this coherence come from? The text argues it stems from a prefigurative linguistic act, a poetic shaping of the historical field before formal analysis begins, setting the stage for the entire interpretation. Applying this trope theory, the text outlines a cyclical development in 19th-century historical consciousness. It starts with the late Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Kant, who, facing the complexities of modernity, adopted an ironic stance towards history. The pre-Romantics like Rousseau and Burke pushed back, advocating a more naive, empathetic approach, essentially using metaphor. Then came the mature phase, roughly 1830 to 1870, marked by a rejection of irony and a flourishing of competing realisms. Thinkers like Hegel leaned towards synecdoche, defending a grand integrated view, while Comte used metonymy to frame history as a comedic progression. The great masters Michelet, Ranke, Tocqueville, and Burckhardt each embodied different tropes: Michelet's passion, Ranke's integration, Tocqueville's typology, Burckhardt's satirical texture. Philosophy of history mirrored this, with Hegel attacked, and Marx emerging with a powerful synthesis of synecdoche and metonymy. But this very success, this proliferation of seemingly valid but conflicting grand narratives, led to the third phase, the crisis of historicism. Confidence in objective scientific history waned. Burckhardt's skepticism and cynicism reflected this. Nietzsche consciously grappled with this irony, attempting a return to metaphor via art. Croce tried to resolve it through philosophy, only to deepen the irony. The cycle seems to end where it began, in a heightened state of self-awareness and relativism. So, wrapping up this section, the narrative presented is one of parallel evolution and eventual convergence. Both the grand philosophical pronouncements about history and the actual practice of historical writing followed similar paths, moving from initial attempts to overcome Enlightenment irony through various forms of realism inspired by metaphor, metonymy, and synecdoche, ultimately returning to a more sophisticated, self-aware, and perhaps skeptical ironic condition by the late 19th century. This cycle suggests that the quest for a single, definitive, unproblematic realism in history might be inherently challenging, reflecting deeper truths about how we construct knowledge and meaning about the past. That sets the stage for further exploration into the specifics of these historical styles and their implications.